Okay, and we'll begin. Thank you very much for joining today. Hello, everyone, wherever you're joining from in the world, and welcome to the second webinar in our series about evidence generation for digital health. We're absolutely delighted that you have taken the time to register and hear our panel of speakers today. So who do we have? Well, in today's webinar, we are bringing together three leading academics in the field of healthcare, all of whom have extensive experience of evaluating and researching new technologies and innovation in healthcare, including some being developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jean Ledger and I am a researcher at University College London, and I am co-chairing this webinar alongside Professor Henry Potts, who's also from UCL. So the way the session will work is we will chair a discussion with our expert panelists for approximately 30 minutes. And we want to leave time for questions from you at the end and engagement with the audience who are here today. So a request from us is to please have any questions that you have in the chat. Please write your comments, contribute to the chat, because Henry will be looking at that and he'll be able to feed questions to our panel after our live discussion. And we'll be monitoring Twitter as well. If you want to join the chat, please use the hashtag #EvaluateDigiHealth. So without further ado, to our panelists. Today we have Anne Blanford. Anne Blanford is Professor of Human-Computer Interaction at University College London, and she brings particular expertise and experience in evaluating digital health solutions in complex systems. We also have Professor Elizabeth Murray, also from UCL, who is a GP by background and Professor of eHealth and Primary Care. And I'm also delighted to have Professor Peter Buckle from Imperial College London. And Peter brings a lot of expertise in ergonomics and human factors research, and he has a focus on improving patient safety and is currently doing a lot of work in diagnostics. So to begin, I'm going to now hand over to our panel and a question for each of you in turn. So if we begin with Elizabeth, can you tell me a little bit about your research, in particular, how you've been involved with digital health in recent years, and maybe give us an example of some of the studies you work on?
Thank you, Jean, and I'd like to say it's a great pleasure to be participating in this webinar this morning. So my work really focuses on the use of digital technology to improve health and healthcare, with an emphasis on providing treatments, particularly non-pharmacological treatments, directly to patients. And if we just think for a moment, the need for this is very clear. All over the world, healthcare costs are going up and up as we manage to look after people better so they live longer. That leads to having an aging population and also puts healthcare costs up. And so, unfortunately, economies don't grow quite at the same pace as our populations. So all healthcare systems need to do more with less. And that's where digital health can come in. So really now for the past 20 years, I've been looking at how we can use digital health to improve health and healthcare. And an example of the sort of work I do is my current project, looking to provide remote supported rehabilitation to people who've got long COVID. Now, as many of our listeners know, unfortunately, it turns out that COVID isn't a short flu-like illness like we were told initially. Many people do make a complete recovery quite quickly, but some unfortunate individuals are left with really long-term symptoms where they're feeling very fatigued, very depressed and anxious, and very breathless. And many people seem to be unable to go back to work for, at the moment it's 6 months, and maybe it'll be longer, who knows. Now, we do know that these sorts of symptoms can be treated and helped by rehabilitation, but the numbers are really too large for the face-to-face rehabilitation services that are offered in the NHS. And so I've been working with some wonderful colleagues from UCL, including Anne Blanford, and from Barts and UCLH and the Royal Free, to put together a package of remote supported rehabilitation where people are able to do rehabilitation exercises, both for mental and physical health, in their own homes, but with the support of a trained rehabilitation clinician.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's really helpful background, and it's really good to hear what you're working on at the moment. I'm going to move on to Peter, who's based at Imperial and also involved in a number of studies at the moment. But Peter, could you tell us a little bit about your background, discipline, and how you've become interested in digital health in recent years?
Thanks, Jean, and hello everybody, wherever you are. So I'm based at Imperial College London, and I lead methodology for a group that are currently looking at in vitro diagnostics. And by the way, Elizabeth, that also includes diagnostics for COVID, which is challenging. But I've ended up there after a career really looking at how we can better understand how people will behave in complex systems. And at the end of the day, everything that we do, everything that is designed for use in healthcare systems has been designed by people. And that includes digital applications, obviously. And how we then implement those, how we develop them, how we use them, and how we integrate with everything around them has become very, very much a focus of what we're doing at Imperial College. So I guess in a sense, what I do is I try and look at how innovation in healthcare actually works within an existing very complex healthcare system. And that has lots of people factors in it. So a simple definition of what I do is to kind of take a user-focused view to design. But what I've learned increasingly in healthcare is that the amount of variability that exists, the complexity of the systems that we're trying to change, means that we have to work in a much more sophisticated way than perhaps you'd first anticipate when people come to us with the best new idea that there's ever been in terms of a digital innovation. And that's particularly true, I think, when we're dealing with technologies that have to have interoperability with other bits of technology and with people. And people behave in ways which are predictable, but we do have to understand before we go anywhere near implementing the technologies. So as it goes on with this webinar, hopefully we'll explore more the need for anyone that's innovating in this space to have a good appreciation of what we call human factors, but certainly human factors in complex systems. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Peter, very much. And that nicely leads us into Anne's work. And you're Professor of Computer and Human Interaction. It's a very dynamic way of looking at things. Could you tell us a bit more about your discipline and the sorts of studies and approaches you take in your work?
Right, so it's great also to be part of this webinar. I'm really looking forward to the conversation in the next hour. So my background is quite mixed. I've got degrees in maths and artificial intelligence, and I've worked in computer science departments and psychology departments. And whichever department I'm in, I always consider to be other. I never feel like I'm quite at home. But I've been involved in health technology projects for probably 20 years. And I started by looking at the kind of low level usability, user experience aspects of them. And then like Peter, I think, I realized that a lot of the issues around whether or not technology is actually taken up and used in practice are about the broader context, the complex, the adaptive systems that represent healthcare more broadly. So now nearly all my projects, in fact, all my projects are with clinicians of one kind or another. So Elizabeth mentioned that I work with her on the COVID recovery project. I'm also working on projects around diabetes, self-management, nephrology, kidney disease, and various other clinical conditions. My perspective is that we're working with people, and people are whole human beings. They're not defined by a particular clinical condition. So we have to deal with the clinical conditions, but we also have to recognize that we're developing technology for people to fit into their daily lives, both for individuals, the public, lay population, and also for health professionals to fit into their working practices. So I see myself as the person who is bringing a human factors perspective or a human computer interaction perspective to think about the design of technologies that are actually going to make a difference in healthcare practice, hopefully.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. That gives everybody listening more understanding of the background. And I think it's worth saying that as well as working on research and evaluations and being involved in teaching and writing, all our panelists have experience with working with people developing innovations as well, which is really important. And there may be developers out there and people working on innovations who have specific questions for our panelists today. I'm going to address this question now to Anne and Elizabeth together, but you wrote a really helpful paper for those of us working in this space, and particularly looking at working on evaluating digital health interventions, about 7 lessons for interdisciplinary research on interactive digital health interventions. And we've already touched on this morning that people are bringing different lenses and backgrounds, but what does that look like in practice? When you're working on a study, you've got a new innovation, you want to evaluate it, how do you bring a different academic discipline, and what does it bring that you might not get in other studies?
Thanks, yes. So I guess it was me who initiated the paper, partly because I found myself having the same conversations with my computer science and HCI colleagues about some of the mysteries of working with clinicians and what a different breed they are. And at the time, Elizabeth and I had already been working together for several years and had a lot of, I think, really enlightening conversations where we kind of had pennies dropping repeatedly, where we've been using the same words and eventually realizing we meant really different things by them. You know, words like evaluation, which is the focus of today. You know, when I talk about evaluation, I'm talking about formative evaluation. Can people use it? Do they find it engaging? Can they use it to support collaboration between different people or to monitor their health conditions or whatever? So it's, can people use it? Whereas Elizabeth will talk a bit more about how that fits in the broader clinical context. So we kept having these conversations, and gradually we worked out how different our conversations were and how different our perspectives were in terms of what our values were and what actually matters at the end of the day. And we framed that in terms of the stages of a development process, from understanding user needs through to deploying at scale. And for me, I don't often think, or I hadn't previously thought much about deployment at scale, because as far as I'm concerned, once it's usable and vaguely useful, then that I've completed my job. And that's where I hand over to Elizabeth for the other perspective. So over to you, Elizabeth.
So it was a real pleasure working with Anne on this paper, because as she said, it was a product of many years of very fruitful conversations. And I think what I'd really like to stress is that in terms of which disciplines do digital health researchers need to work with, it all depends on the question. And the question changes as you're going through the trajectory of developing and using something that's going to make a real difference to people's health and healthcare. So right at the very beginning, you need to work with patients. The one group of people that I would say are always essential to work with are patients and users, patients, the public. But at the very beginning, you want to be very clear what the problem is that you're trying to help. And that may require epidemiology, it may require psychology, it may require clinicians, it will certainly require patients. Then you think about how digital can help. And there you'll definitely be wanting to work with human factors people and computer science to see what's possible. There's a long period, and I think that people from my background, by which I mean biomedics and health services researchers, really underplay how important getting the intervention right is. And there's a tendency in the biomedical field to go straight to our sort of summative evaluation, often by doing trials, and I'm sure we'll talk about trials later. but I'm a great advocate for spending as much time as is required to get an intervention that is useful, is usable, people enjoy using it, and it really fits with the context where it's going to be used. And for me, that context is healthcare. So, you know, does it work in clinical flows? Do the clinicians using it find it easy and that it saves them time, that it makes their patients better? And do the patients like using it and find it helpful and useful? And within that, I think you really have to think right from the beginning about deployment at scale, because all healthcare, but the NHS in particular, is a huge organisation. And the problems that we've seen over and over again with the non-use of digital technology in healthcare is a problem, because it means there's a lot of wasted resource. And so I think that you need to think about what I mean by implementation, that is deployment at scale, from the very beginning, when you first start to decide what is it that's the problem and why do we think digital can be a solution. And so I always work with patients and the public. I always work with clinicians. At different stages, I will be working with epidemiologists, human-computer interaction, computer scientists, implementation scientists, behavioral psychologists, but also the more traditional evaluative disciplines like health economics and statistics. And my teams are really interdisciplinary.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's really, really helpful. And just some early feedback, when you're both speaking, it's more like a long process we're talking about, or an iterative process with different stages and potentially different skills and people coming on board, which might be different from how we might design a trial and think about it as a more bounded type of study potentially. Peter, given what we've heard, I'd like to ask for your insights, bearing in mind your work, and particularly, I mean, Anne's mentioned human factors and you have so far. What does it look like in practice for you? Is it the same types of interdisciplinary dynamics? Who do you need to bring into a team and when, and how does human factors add to an evaluation of digital health?
Sure. Yeah, well, I would echo everything that Anne and Elizabeth have said. Obviously, we work in the same space. I think when I look at the journey of these things, I think that can be very illustrative of the challenges we're up against. So at Imperial, we have a team that is focused on really strong methodologies that will allow us to explore the human factors issues, as well as the value that something might bring to healthcare. So we have a team that look at that. But we are integrated very, very closely with not just patients and the public, but clinicians across a large swathe of London. We look at how things may be implemented using the best engineers, the best technologists, the best AI specialists, because we realize that it is this multidisciplinary challenge. But the journey that things go on, I think, is probably the most interesting bit for me. We live in a world where, and I'm sure many of the people on this call today, where you've got a great new idea. You've got an idea for something that will change the health service as you see it, or something that you think can go from one sector into another sector, let us say from a transport sector into the healthcare sector. Now, the problem with that is it may well be that the answer that you think you've got doesn't really fit the questions that we should be asking. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that actually what you're bringing to the table is potentially going to fit within an existing system that is already very complex and very difficult to interpret. So we have a bit of a kind of an adage, I guess, which sounds a bit patronizing at first sight, but really isn't meant to be. It's supposed to be a way of starting a proper dialogue. So if any of you out there have got a great new idea for an app or a bit of digital healthcare innovation, we have to say to you, we really have to understand work is done, what's really going on as the system at the moment, not what you imagine it is. And when we start down that route, we start to understand that the complexity of the thing that you wish to change needs to be understood before you go ahead and try and make that change. And if we don't do that, then there's a real chance that we'll innovate in a space that actually isn't helpful, might make things worse, might compromise patient safety, and certainly won't deliver the rewards that you're expecting. So at the earliest stage, we kind of look at this kind of innovation and how it's going to work within a complex system. So immediately we'll go and talk to the patients, public, we'll go and talk to clinicians, we'll talk to all those in the system to try and get their perspective of where and how this thing might be useful. And over again, we find two things really. One is that actually it's not going to be that helpful in the way that you've envisaged it. And the second thing is, it might be helpful, but not where you envisaged it. So classically, we see people think that something's going to be very useful, let us say in the acute care sector. So we go and talk to a consultant cardiologist about a brand new app that someone's come up with. And they'll say, nah, it's not going to help me very much, but go and talk to the GPs in primary care. They might find it useful. So I think there is inevitably with innovators an assumption that you've got something that is going to change the world. It might. But I reckon on the whole, it won't, because you haven't done the other side of the equation. So we work with anyone who's got a bright idea to see how and where it would be most beneficial. And I think that probably goes for Anne Elizabeth as well. But it's very important that you see the world through that lens.
There may be companies or people moving into the digital health space that think the randomized control trial is the gold standard, particularly if you come from a biomedical background. But what we're talking about here is much more user engagement, going out talking to people, understanding the system context quite early on. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about the trial within the digital health space? Would you say people should be going down that path, or is it being flexible with different approaches depending on your intervention?
Jean, if I can start with that, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that it does depend on your research question and where you are in the trajectory of development, evaluation and deployment. Because there's no point in doing a trial until you're absolutely clear that your intervention is usable by the people who need to use it. That's usually patients and clinicians. That the people who use it find it helpful and beneficial, and that there appears to be the benefits that you thought there would be and why you went down that path. But once you've got all that data, and you do want to go across the NHS or whichever healthcare system you're working with, you have to think that you are in competition with all sorts of other interventions, not just digital, but things that are delivered face-to-face, or drugs or medicines, or even just doing nothing. And all health services are cash limited. It's very overt in the NHS, but all health systems are cash limited. And so all health systems are experiencing opportunity costs. If they pay for intervention X, they can't pay for intervention Y. And that's where you come down to the need for comparative data, where you can see what benefit a health service is going to be able to deliver to our patients. And that's what healthcare is all about. It's about making people better and using the resource and the money that's available to make people better as wisely as possible. And you can only do that if you've got comparative data on how much benefit accrues from different interventions and how much the cost of these different interventions is. And for that very narrow question, the method that is best suited to answer it is the randomized controlled trial. But the randomized controlled trial can only answer one question, and that is, what is the effect or efficacy and cost effectiveness of a particular intervention when compared with something else that's been specified. And that data, although essential for people to make decisions about which interventions to use is absolutely not everything that you need to know about a digital health intervention. So a trial is necessary at some point, but absolutely not the only evaluation that is needed.
That's really helpful. Anna, do you have something to add also about that, and maybe then what else is needed, maybe when you have got some good comparative data?
Well, it's often before you have good comparative data, in fact. I think that one thing Elizabeth didn't mention there is that, you know, even with drugs, with medications, it's not always the same medication that's given to everybody who has a particular set of symptoms, because there is this growing idea of precision medicine, personalized medicine, whatever, you know, different terms for it. And that's even more true for digital technologies, where in a sense, part of it is about engaging the person's cognition, their brain, their personhood. So I think we need to also think about for whom is a particular digital intervention appropriate, and it won't necessarily be all the population. You know, there are some very obvious exclusions, like possibly small children or people with cognitive impairments for certain kinds of interventions, but there are also other things about people's value systems, lifestyles, the ways that they think, the things that they value, whether they like numbers or don't like numbers. You know, there are going to be lots of factors that actually determine whether a particular digital intervention is likely to work for a particular population. So we need to think about for whom an intervention might work. And that requires a kind of formative research. There's no point in doing an RCT that involves everybody if we know that this particular kind of intervention is most likely to be effective for a subpopulation, because that subpopulation might then get lost and make an RCT non-significant, when in fact it is a really valuable intervention for some people. I think there's also issues around the fact that we need to do these kinds of formative evaluation that are not RCT based, but that are seeking to improve an intervention, to make it better along the way before it's meaningful to actually run an RCT that's going to be, if you like, fair to the intervention. You know, if it's not as good as it can be, then doing an RCT on it is almost certainly going to show no effect or no significant effect. So it's about doing asking different kinds of evaluation questions at different stages in the development process, in order to get to the point where we can have confidence in deploying a technology at scale. But still, we need to know what are the success factors that make that technology work at scale, which is not itself an RCT type question. So the RCT has to be used with other complementary questions that ask about modes of delivery and to whom, and whether the system should be adaptable, or a variety of other kinds of questions along the way.
It's really helpful. So, I mean, it may be uncomfortable for some people who are used to doing a kind of standalone trial or summative evaluation to have this more kind of action research, user engagement, development up front. So you really understand the intervention and for whom it works and who it doesn't before you maybe are even ready for a trial. I'd like to go to Peter, particularly around complexity. And you mentioned earlier about these sort of dynamics within healthcare systems, and you might go to a cardiologist and say, look at this intervention, and say, actually, it might not work in the system context or our workflows. How do you get at that through evaluation and evidence generation? And when do you do that kind of work?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. Why not? I think RCTs are hugely overrated in the context of a lot of the work that we do. I think RCTs really developed out of a very pharmaceutical-led, is this white pill better than that white pill? And it probably works, probably does a pretty good job, which makes decision-making easier then about which drug you should buy in terms of, let's say, quality of life, years saved for specific health conditions. Trouble with that, as Anne and Elizabeth have alluded to, is that when you try and roll that out into other interventions in healthcare, which have sometimes even more subtle effects on the system, they don't have such direct effects on patient outcomes. And certainly where I work in diagnostics, where the impact of an intervention is perhaps a long way upstream from where the benefits and changes might actually accrue, it's much, much harder to see why a traditional RCT type design is going to be the optimum way of trying to assess the value of this intervention. And in any event, when we start to look at value in terms of some things, what does that really mean? You know, who is it valuable to? Is it saving some time for a clinician, which then might be able to use that time more efficiently, perhaps on patients with other disorders compared to the one that you're looking at? It may well be that actually value is added through dignity to the patient because they can do something in their own home that otherwise they would have had to travel to a clinic to. So trying to assess the impact of these things, I think, requires us to be much more agile about looking at all the types of trial designs that could be used, whether they be formative or summative. We can learn from it. So the evidence that you need to influence the system isn't necessarily going to be acquired through RCTs. So, for example, if you introduce some digital technologies, perhaps something as simple as an app, then we have to think very carefully about who is going to be the end recipient of it, what kind of additional training they have, how it will impact on how they do their work in the real world. So we have examples where junior doctors with great intention have come up with apps that will help them, I don't know, let us say, administer drugs more effectively, complex drug regimes on their ward. And this then get passed on to other people who think, right, well, I'll use it on my ward. Well, it may be completely inappropriate to use it there. So evaluating these things, unless the context in which it is going to be evaluated is very carefully defined, we will have problems with. So we collect evidence in lots of different ways. We will use all of those trial design types in different measure, in different ways, to try and assess whether or not this thing is having the kind of impact that might be helpful. The final point I would make on it, it does depend on what the adverse consequences of using these digital health interventions might be. It may be, let us say there's an app out there at the moment which I know can inform you as to which of your nearest A&E departments has the shortest waiting times, and it's combined with one which will tell you how long it will take to get there on public transport. Well, the worst outcome of that is, well, one outcome of that might be is that someone that's suffering from something might take 20 minutes longer to get seen than they would have done somewhere else. Other apps, it may be the difference between you getting urgent surgery or not getting urgent surgery. So the consequences of the interventions actually might also be one of the things that you would take into consideration when you start to look at which trial designs you have most trust in. So I think we have to say all of these tools are there in the toolbox at our disposal, and we should be very, very clear about why we're using which one. There will always be the critics that say, well, if you haven't done a double-blind randomized controlled trial, we're not looking at it. Well, I'm sorry, you're not up to speed with what's really required in that case, and I don't particularly value your judgment at this point. So there you go, that's me.
Thank you for the for that view, because it's spot on. And what's coming up here is a much more complex picture of evidence generation to get a whole picture of a digital health intervention as it develops over time, as it fits in the system context, and finding out who it's going to work for. I would like to now just focus on engagement with companies, and I know that all of you have very full inboxes with inquiries and people wanting to work with you to validate and research their interventions. Do you have any thoughts or reflections based on your experience of where it really works with academics working well with companies and developers? Is there anything that you would like to recommend both for academics and developers in this space for, you know, how we do this successful evidence generation in partnership?
My advice is always to come and talk with us very, very, very early on at the concept stage. And whether you're an entrepreneur in industry, whether you are an academic with a great idea, whether you're a clinician who's seen something on the walls which makes you think there's an opportunity, come and talk to those of us that deal with this kind of thing, whether it be Anne Elizabeth, myself, at the earliest stage of your thinking. Once the concept has hardened into a bit of software or a bit of hardware even, or the two combined, it gets more difficult for us to work with you to really see where the true value of this thing might lie. And that's particularly true where there's going to have to be interoperability with other bits of technology and so on, or there's training issues. So my advice to anyone is come and talk to us very early, go through the organisations that are out there that will help you through the National Institute for Health Research Structures, the NIHR infrastructure, NOCRI, groups like that. BIVDA if you're interested in vitro diagnostics, but go to them early so as they can talk with those that can help build with you from a concept stage what might be required, do the stakeholder talking with the people that might be the end users very, very early on, because it may be that you've got a great idea, but once you start to package it up in a certain way, it becomes less useful. So yeah, start early, start at the conceptual stage is my advice to industry, academics, everybody.
Anne and Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts before we go into questions from the audience?
Yeah, so I would definitely echo what Peter's just said, in that it really is about starting early. But I think it's also about thinking flexibly about what evaluation questions you need to ask at different points. So I've had quite a few conversations where in industry, people approaching me from industry have assumed that it had to be a trial, and we're not accepting the fact that that has its place, but it's not the only method, and it's not necessarily the right approach at a particular stage in development. And recognizing that actually there aren't quick fixes. We all wish there were really quick fixes, but actually this is a long road, and maybe that's why digital health interventions haven't had as much impact to date as in principle we think they ought to have done, because people try to get to the end result quicker than it is actually possible. So accepting that it is a long road.
And what I'd like to add, absolutely agree with Peter and Anne. What I'd like to add though, is that it has to be a genuine partnership. I have been asked, I mean, I do tend to get asked in later in the stage because obviously I am more distal, and so it tends to be industrial partners who've got a product that's very well developed and often already in use, and then come to me and say, how can we evaluate this? And the times when this is problematic is when when it's not a genuine partnership. It has to be a partnership of equals, where there is trust and mutual sharing and mutual learning. So I think that would be my main point. And just to reiterate what I think it's the underlying point that both Pete and Anne are making, is it all depends on your question.
Thank you. So this has been absolutely fantastic, rich insights, but I'm going to bring Henry on screen and invite Henry, who's been looking at the chat, to field some questions that may have come through from the conversation today online. Henry, are you there?
Hello world, I'm Henry Potts, assisting Jean in this webinar. I'm at UCL along with Anne and Elizabeth, but in a different department. Lots of questions in the chat. We won't have time for all of those, but let's tackle some of them. So someone asked, would you recommend the MRC framework for complex interventions, which is something I know a lot of colleagues in health research look at. I wondered if anyone had thoughts on that. Does it work for digital?
The real answer is kind of no, because the very first block of the MRC framework is the one where all the digital development work has to happen. So the digital is really front loaded within the MRC framework. It assumes a kind of intervention that can be devised, deployed, tested, retested around the iterative stages of the cycle. Sorry, I'm imagining it in my head. Apologies to those of you on the call who aren't familiar with it. But actually all the iteration that would happen in the development and testing of a digital component to any intervention is all kind of hidden within the first stage of the MRC cycle. So it tells us a lot about how that might scale up, because the MRC cycle is focusing on large scale deployment and evaluation at scale. But there's a lot of development work around the digital that has been the focus this morning, that is underplayed within the MRC cycle. So it's not to say the MRC cycle is wrong in any way, but that all the digital formative evaluation work is underplayed and hidden within the very first stage of developing an intervention before deploying at scale.
I'd like to add to what Anne says, because I completely agree with everything she said. And if you look at our paper, there's a figure in it where Anne superimposes the HCI cycle onto the MRC cycle, and it's a very useful diagram, that one. But I think in terms of the trajectory all the way from thinking about a problem to getting something deployed at scale, the MRC framework is useful. And as Pete said, it is based very much on a pharma model. But there's a lot to learn from pharma research. And I think we shouldn't throw out the learning that we've acquired rather painfully over the last 100 years about pharma research. So I'm more positive about the MRC model. I do use it when I teach, but I use it in conjunction with the HCI cycle.
I'd like to add, Henry, to that, is that, of course, it's useful. It's a very sound and sensible piece of work, and it's helpful for anyone thinking about making interventions in complex systems. I think at a more practical level, though, the thing that I've found more useful, I don't know whether people are aware of the World Health Organization guide on monitoring and evaluating digital health interventions. Are you all aware of that? I find that a really useful guidebook, and I advocate anyone that's going to get into this space to have a look at it. And it deals with all of these phases of formative, summative, so on and so forth. It deals with different trial designs. It would be an ideal introductory text for anyone that wanted to do it. Probably more accessible than the MRC documents, to be honest. So maybe we can find a way of letting everyone have a link to that document if they haven't seen it already.
Very quickly, Henry, we should, I would agree, second that, we should link to the MRC, the WHO, and also your own work on Public Health England's pages on tools for evaluation for anyone who wants to find out more.
All those links are in the chat if people want to look there. Another question. So we hear a lot about the importance of co-design, co-production when you're designing a system, but someone asks, what do you do if you've got a digital solution that's already been designed, but you're now looking at rolling it out to different sites and contexts? What do you do around co-design, co-production there with patients or clinicians? Is that something we can still do in a useful way?
So I would say that you're already working with the resource. I mean, you have to then establish whether or not that resource is suitable for deploying within a particular context. But actually you are designing the context. You know, you can never plug, or very, very rarely plug, a digital solution into an existing care pathway or workflow without changing that pathway or workflow. And co-design is at least as important at that stage as it is at the stage of developing the digital technology in the first place, because it has to work in context. And that means the context has to be adapted to accommodate the technology in an optimal way. So that co-design still needs to happen. It's just at a later stage in the process.
It's a toughie, that, because you've already got something which everyone's saying is great. So can we just fit it in? I think the co-design is about adapting your existing system to accommodate it. And then you still need to do some trials of some sort to see if it's actually making things better or worse. We've seen endless cases of people take things from one system, plug it into another system, and actually make that second system worse. It just doesn't convey the benefits that it did in the first system. And that's because certainly in healthcare, there is so much variability, huge amounts of variability. So something that's tried and tested in, we have this all the time, something that's tried and tested maybe in specialist hospitals in London does not translate well when it's then, when we try and trial it in community hospitals that don't have the same level of expertise or resource, or just a different patient base. So we have to be very, very aware that plug and play with this type of thing in the context of healthcare, you've really got to go through, it's not exactly co-design, but you've certainly got to go through a different process to see if it's going to embed appropriately and what other changes might need to be made in that system. Or perhaps you just don't, you reject it. There's nothing wrong with saying, actually, it's not going to work here.
Yeah, I agree with both Pete and Anne. And I would say that one of the things about randomized controlled trials, particularly of complex interventions like digital health interventions, is that we're rather bad at reporting the context in which that trial is done. And when you change the context, you tend to change the efficacy or the effectiveness. And a good example of the sort of thing that Pete's talking about is that there's rather a bad habit amongst our politicians of importing solutions from America because they think, oh, you know, it's the Americans fund, it's wonderful, why don't we just import it? And they don't realize that the American healthcare system is very different to the British one. And that so they're often often can cause more harm than good. I think what we're really talking about here is also the need to work with implementation scientists. And here I'm using the word implementation in the biomedical sense of deployment at scale, but they are the people who study how do you get something that exists into widespread use and practice across multiple systems or multiple contexts. And here I find very useful some things, for instance, normalization process theory, which Henry can put a link to up, but it's normalizationprocesstheory.org, and ways of thinking about how the intervention that you've got will or will not integrate into other healthcare systems. And again, it's like, as we've said before, it's all about the question.
To move on to another question. We have a question here about how has your experience of interdisciplinary working impacted on how you assess things like usability when you're doing a formative evaluation, or has it?
Yes, but it's not, it does impact, but I think if you've been trained in the areas kind of human factors, economics and so on, you would expect that. So it's how you go about, in a sense, designing something which encompasses that variability and taking those things on board. So I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but I ask all people that come to me with new designs, new innovations, the first question is, I say, who is this not designed for? Because if people don't know who it isn't designed for, they probably really haven't thought who it is designed for. So that's kind of a way of starting the conversation around it. So yeah, I think good human factors groups like UCL and ourselves at Imperial have embraced that as almost rule one in terms of how you go about doing the work we do every day.
I guess what I would add in relation to the question was, I'm not sure I've changed the way I think about usability as a small part of this picture, particularly significantly, but I've recognized in working with Elizabeth and many other clinical colleagues, the importance of a range of other questions, that usability is only one of many, many factors that will contribute to the success of a product deployed at scale in the real world. So, and I've come more and more to the kind of complex systems view that Peter articulated so well earlier, that I think we need to think about how we talk about usability, which kind of assumes a fairly fixed system, while also recognizing that the systems are forever changing and dependent on a wide variety of different kind of factors to make them behave the way they're behaving in any particular context. And actually that's a real big challenge for human computer interaction as a discipline, is to be able to square that circle of assuming that you know how something will be used while also recognizing that you don't know how something will be used in practice. And we don't have good answers to that, to those challenges yet.
In the final minutes, maybe we can just do a very quick fire question, which is, as an academic, how do you decide what projects or what collaborations to work on? Is it just about who's got funding?
Nice and controversial there, Henry.
If I could say one thing, I think that's kind of a bit of a loaded question. COVID research has taught me that actually sometimes you do work that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen to do, but it's really important. And therefore, if you can engage your skills in tackling challenges that you think are really important, that the country thinks are really important, then that helps determine to some extent what you do. And I hope that as academics, we look at the value of what we bring to something, not just whether or not there's money there.
Yeah, so I was going to say that, but I will also be very honest and say that I choose to work with people whose company I enjoy and that I enjoy working with and that I trust. Why work with people that you don't get on with well? But making a difference is really important to me.
I would echo that. I mean, I choose my work according to where I think it's going to have the most impact, because my combination of skill sets is quite rare, of being both clinical and digital. So there's far more for me to do than I could ever do in multiple lifetimes, however often I clone to myself. So I choose things which I'm going, like Anne, which I'm going to enjoy, like Anne and Pete, where it's going to have benefit. And sometimes there's something about, well, if I think I am absolutely the best person to do it, then I will do it, even if I can't quite fit it in.
So just one, we've spoken a lot about interdisciplinary working with companies, and there's obviously, you have some very successful experience, but very broadly, are the right communities of practice talking to each other about digital health? I mean, I guess, is the good collaboration the exception to the norm? Do we need to make more effort to get different groups across clinicians and health providers, insurers, policymakers, academics? Do we need more opportunities just to be connecting? I guess a lot of people would say sometimes this work is happening in silos. Do you have any final reflections on that?
My reflection is it's a very complex landscape out there. And I think if you're new to it, it's pretty hard to navigate, and therefore find some partners that have been there before. And even then it's complex, but it is bound to be because of the nature of the beast. But I don't think it's like there's no single portal that you can go through. So I think you do have to form these proper networks, as you're doing with this webinar, by the way. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, and I'd add that I think we are making progress, but it is inevitably, the progress feels small compared to the scale of the challenge. But we're seeing on the research front, we're seeing UKRI, which is the kind of joining together, the umbrella over the main engineering and MRC kind of research councils. They're working much more closely together now, and they recognize that digital health is a particularly important area for working across the funding bodies. And they're also trying to work out, obviously, innovation. Have I got the right name? Innovate UK is also part of that conglomerate, and working out with other organizations to actually start to build the kinds of connections that we're talking about here. Obviously, there is also a big landscape around innovation and around startups and industry developments. And it's important that we maintain those links and build those links where it's appropriate and where those can be fruitful. But I think we are making progress. I do feel hopeful about this.
Great. And Elizabeth, are you feeling hopeful about progress, that the networks are being built and the infrastructure to help support evidence generation? And
yes, I mean, when I started in this field, which is 20 years ago now, I was regularly told there wasn't such a thing as e-health, what we now call digital health. And I've really noticed an enormous change over the last 20 years, yes.
Well, that is a positive note to end the webinar on. I just want to thank you all so much for your contributions. Thank you to everybody for joining online and registering. Please spread the word about the webinars. We have 2 more coming up, one on mental health and another one looking on evidence generations and applying theoretical frameworks, with Trish Greenhouse as well. So thank you very much, but particularly to Anne, Elizabeth and Peter today, and to Henry for joining, looking at the questions, and to technical support. So thank you very much for your time.